Hello, Poppets. Okay, now we're going to talk about the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Okay, I know these sound strange, these terms. In neuroscience, there's a lot of very fancy language, so I want you to repeat it so you become familiar with it. Dorsal column medial lemniscus system. And you're going to see why it's called that as we start talking about the pathway itself. Now, this particular pathway is a sensory pathway, and it carries 4 different types of information. It carries something called soft or discriminative touch. Soft or discriminative touch would be things like being aware of clothing against your skin, or feeling somebody touching your skin, or pressure sensation like you were holding something within your hand. It also carries proprioception, which is your awareness of where you are in space. And I'm not talking specifically about the body as a whole, but actually every individual aspect of your body having an understanding of the orientation and the way that it's moving. It also carries vibration information and something called 2-point discrimination. And 2-point discrimination is basically where you can feel 2 simultaneous points touching you. In your finger, that could be as small as 2 pinheads because you've got tons of receptors located in here. But if you were talking about something like your back, you could actually probably put it within about a 6-inch margin and you would still feel that as one single touch. The receptors are much more widely spread, not very densely packed at all, so it's not as sensitive in that way in that area. Okay, now as I said, this is a sensory system. Because it's a sensory system, it means that you have to start from the bottom or the skin and move upwards to hit the brain. And there are some major landmarks that I want to talk you through. First, within your skin, so that could be the skin of my finger, that could be with the skin of my toes, there are lots of different types of receptors that are going to be embedded in the skin, picking up things like the pressure or a soft touch or vibration. And that's going to be in the extremity. Things that you also want to be aware of. So this is going to indicate a specific spinal segment. This is the dorsal root, and this is the ventral root. The dorsal root is the one at the back. You've always got sensory information coming in here. The root here at the front, the ventral root, is always the one that would have motor control going out. Okay, so the dorsal root is the one that we're interested in here. Now we're coming up to the brainstem. So if you think of the brainstem as a whole, this would be the base of your skull, and here's your medulla, your pons, and your midbrain, and the nerve pathway is going to travel through that. This represents the thalamus, and remember we talked about the thalamus being the gatekeeper to the cerebral cortex, like the secretary of the brain, and the thalamus will help to direct attention or divert attention away. We're not always aware of all the sensation of clothing against our skin because that would be overwhelming, so it helps to direct attention a little bit. And then our final bit on both sides, this is the somatosensory cortex. It's also known as S1 because this is the dumping area for sensory information, and that's going to be located in the parietal lobe of your brain. Okay, so let's talk about how the nerve pathway operates. So let's pretend that I have felt a sensation on the bottom of my big toe. On the bottom of my big toe, and you can see on my man here, that's on the left side. So it's underneath the base of my left big toe. This is going to be related to a spinal level called S1. And we talk about dermatomes and things like that separately, but for this right now, bear with me, it's going to be related to S1. And what happens is I have that receptor picking up pressure sensation, and that is going to start an action potential which is passed, like a football would be passed from person to person to person, traveling along the axon of a first order neuron. There are 3 neurons in this pathway, and this is the first because we have to start at the bottom. So I've got action potential starting at my big toe, traveling up the axon all the way into my leg, and then it's going to enter into my spine. And remember, sensory information comes in through the dorsal root, And then what's going to happen is it's going to go up the white material. Okay? So this here, it's entering specifically at S1. This is still the axon of that first order neuron. And it's going to be traveling through something called the fasciculus gracilis. Fasciculus is a fancy word for tract or pathway. Gracilis is the name of that pathway. And the way that I remember this is gracilis for G is like the ground. So this is going to be specific to information coming from my lower body or from my legs. Okay? So it started a receptor. It's triggered an action potential, which is being passed like a football all along the axon, traveling up the skin of my leg, entering into S1 at that dorsal root on the same left side, and then it's traveling up through the white matter. Now, let's say that this here, this is C5, for instance. It's still going to be passing all the way through the spine. And this part of the pathway is the dorsal column. Okay? Along fasciculus gracilis. And it's going to travel all the way up my spine through that white matter until it hits the medulla. And all of that, from the base of my big toe all the way up to the brainstem, is that single first order neuron. Think how long that must be. That's just amazing, isn't it? Okay, so that's what happens first. Well, as you might imagine, that's a long way for that action potential to travel on that first order neuron. So we need to get another neuron involved. So this is the second order neuron, and basically what happens is it synapses here at the medulla. But we know that sensory information from the left side of the body is actually going to be taken in by the right side of the brain. And likewise, motor control for the left side of the body would be underdone by the right motor cortex. And the reason for that is because after the first order and the second order neuron synapse, the second order neuron decussates. It decussates, or it crosses. Okay, it crosses the medulla to the contralateral side, and now it starts to travel upwards. And it's traveling upwards here through something called the medial lemniscus pathway. Okay, but notice we've gone from the left side now to the right side. That second order neuron is much shorter. It's just traveling from the medulla. Decussation occurs up to the thalamus. Now the thalamus is made up of lots of kind of interconnected nuclei, groups of neuronal cell bodies with similar functions. And the specific point that it goes to in the thalamus is called the ventral posterolateral nucleus, okay, or the VPL for short. And it stops there. And what happens at that point is that it too will synapse. And it synapses now with the third order neuron. And the third order neuron is going to project, again, we're now on the contralateral side, on the right side, up into S1 within the parietal lobe. And the cell body is going to be there at S1, telling the body all the way down that the base of the big toe is getting some sort of pressure sensation. Okay? So again, to recap what's happening and what you would be expected to be able to draw. If you were looking at pressure sensation on the base of the left big toe, a receptor, you always start with receptor, is going to trigger an action potential, which is passed like a football along the axon of the first order neuron, and that axon runs all the way up the leg to enter into its corresponding dermatomal nerve root, which is S1 in this case. And that basically goes in through the ventral root, the dorsal root, and it starts to ascend up all the way up the spine through the dorsal column via the fasciculus gracilis. And remember, gracilis is like the ground, so this is the specific traffic for my leg, for my lower body. Now, at the medulla, the first order and the second order neuron, they synapse, okay? Kind of like they're giving each other a high five. And what's going to happen is this action potential is going to be passed along the second order neuron. Now the second order neuron decussates, or it crosses over, and the action potential is actually going to travel up the axon, which is now on the opposite side of the body. So it's shifted from the left to the right, and that's traveling through the brainstem, so through medulla, through pons, through midbrain, up to the thalamus. And again, it's going to stop specifically at the VPL nucleus, the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Now again, the second order neuron and the third order neuron are going to synapse. The action potential is now going to be passed like that football along the axon of that third order neuron, and the cell body of that third order neuron is going to be located within the primary somatosensory cortex, or S1, located in the parietal lobe on the right side of the body. And this is how the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway works.